Hello and welcome to the Boston Herald video podcast. My very special guest today is Danny Fingeroth, who, in addition to being a fellow admirer of Bob Dylan, is a published author. Um, I'm going to give you the description that is in his new book about Jack Ruby, The Many Faces of Oswald's Assassin, which was published by the Chicago Review Press. And it's probably not a coincidence that the book was published this past November 21st, the day before that date in 1965, when Bob Dylan married his first wife, Sarah. So this is what it says. Danny Fingeroth is a biographer and cultural historian commentator specializing in the intersection of Jewish and American cultures. He's the author of Superman on the Couch and Disguised as Clark Kent. His acclaimed 2019 biography of Stan Lee, A Marvelous Life, is a laser-sharp look at this controversial figure, the innovative force behind the beginnings of Marvel Comics. Fingeroth has spoken at venues including the Smithsonian Institute and Columbia University, as well as on NBC's Today Show and NPR's All Things Considered. And I might add the Switchyard Bob Dylan Symposium this year. He has, which we'll get into. He has written commentaries for publications, including the Los Angeles Times and the Wall Street Journal. Fingeroth was born, raised, and lives in New York City. So, Danny, welcome to Crossing the Jack Ruby Con.
Well, thank you for inviting me. Why that introduction was almost as if I'd written it myself.
So, first of all, how are you surviving the holiday season this year?
Well, so far it's just Hanukkah, and the world is crazier than ever. So I'm surviving pretty well. Had a big family shindig the other day, and everybody seems to have survived. So
everyone's still talking to everybody else.
As far as I know, I haven't tried to leave any phone messages and see if they'll be returned. But yeah, I think everybody played nice, and I actually I haven't been a hermit, but I've been limiting. If you don't count like the Bob Dylan Festival and the San Diego Comic-Con, I've been sort of limiting my large events in the wake of COVID.
Yeah. So first, a little history between the two of us. I guess we were virtual friends on social media, but we didn't really know each other until this year. I had planned to go to this year's Bob Dylan Symposium in Tulsa this past June as part of the Switchyard celebration. And I planned to arrive a day earlier than I originally announced. The original announced on June 2nd through 4th. I was planning on just giving one presentation. So I was invited to give another one. And then it was announced that they would begin on June 1st. And then I received a message from you, and you invited me to a panel. Do you want to tell me how that came about?
Well, I think maybe there may be 2 or 3 people in the world who are experts in Bob Dylan and comic books. One is a guy named Brian Cronin, who has done a lot of the heavy lifting and has found a million different references in comic books to Dylan. And he's got a great website, which I'm forgetting the name of, but his name is Brian Cronin. Maybe a couple of other people, but
Rob Kelly.
Oh, duh, Rob Kelly. That would be the other one. Yes. And again, and I apologize to anybody else I'm leaving out. Rob Kelly, Brian Cronin. People whose interest overlaps. I guess I brought up Brian because Brian, as I did that heavy lifting of, I think when Dylan turned 75, he found like 75 references to Dylan. And I went to Google at one point, and it took a while till I realized, every one of these Dylan and comics references seems to be coming from this same guy's website, who I knew kind of from the comics online world. Anyway, so I don't know whether Brian or Rob had ever proposed to the Dylan Symposium, the Dylan Conference, a Dylan and Comics panel, but I did in 2019. But it didn't work out for me to come out. I missed that one, and then we had COVID, and then there were a couple of online ones. And then finally this year, especially because I had a new book out, I proposed several panels. One was Dylan and comics, and the other was Dylan and the JFK assassination, because I have this this book, this Jack Ruby biography that just came out. So I proposed those two and they accepted them. And then I heard about this Switchyard, which was sort of related to the Dylan conference, and maybe the whole thing is under even the Dylan conference maybe is sort of under the general Switchyard heading. I'm not quite clear. So I pitched a couple of things to that, and they accepted. I had one of the panels about the X-Men, 60 years of the X-Men, and how they relate to stories of discrimination and persecution and prejudice. And so I had that accepted. I had the Dylan and JFK, and then my Dylan and comics proposal was accepted, but was combined with Dylan and comedy, which at first I found perplexing. And then I sort of thought about it. I understand why they would do it, and then I figured, okay, well, a lot of these references to Dylan in comics, even if they weren't intended as funny in the comic book itself, when you show it to a general audience, it takes on a comedic aspect, and I decided to roll with that. And so that was the origin. If you want, we can talk more about the panels themselves, but I think that was a very long answer to just one question. And so, does it want to keep this interview to under 24 hours? We should.
Well, they can examine it like there's a Zapruder film, I guess, if they want all the details. And then so then there was the Murder Most Foul JFK panel. You invited me. You invited me. I was glad to participate, and then had to reschedule my flights, get up at 3:30 in the morning.
I remember that. That's right. You were racing the clock to get there in time for the JFK panel. Well, I think one thing you and I have in common, we have a lot of things in common. One thing we have in common is distinctive names. So it's kind of, it's like if you were like, whatever, Steve Stern. I might have had you might not have jumped out at me,
Right.
Just by your name alone, but like Harold Lapidus, I'm guessing you're probably the only Harold Lapidus, possibly in existence. I don't know, except maybe you have a relative with the same name. I don't know. But,
yeah, I'm not aware of one. I don't think. I think maybe there is one somewhere in the world that someone pointed out once, but know anything about it. I don't think it's related.
But anyway, I think I'm the only Danny or Daniel Fingeroth, and so that somehow, just like on Facebook especially, or on social media, the algorithms are going to put us together, especially with our common interests. And so I knew you were going to the conference, and it is, since I had not been to the conference before, although I would say that I've just been discussing this with a friend, imposter syndrome, so I would say I certainly suffer from my share of it. And although I've been a Dylan fan since I was a teenager, and probably know more about Bob Dylan than the average person, in the world of Dylan scholarship, I still feel like an imposter. It was so I guess sort of, you seem to know a bunch of people who are going, and 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 um, and you were a great source of information and inspiration. Because when I asked you, uh, for suggestions or for advice, you actually took me seriously and did. So yeah, I feel like although I'm a lifelong Dylan fan, and I have actually been in the room where Bob Dylan's bar mitzvah happened. So I think I've been to Hibbing. I've done my share of firsthand Dylan research just by dint of growing up in New York City. I come
You've done
across.
some hard traveling.
I've done some hard traveling, some not so hard traveling. But I don't even remember what the question. So, what?
Oh, no, we're just riffing, I didn't think I had a question, but we're just, yeah. So, Yeah, I had previously written about JFK, and
Right.
so I went through my notes and came up with a little talk that was supposed to be around 20 minutes or so. I got there, and coincidentally, with the new flight, the stopover was in Dallas, which was weird.
That's interesting.
Anyway, I was sleep deprived. I got there just in time, and it was a great experience. Great meeting you. But
Well, the secret to doing a great panel is getting smart people to be on the panel with you. So it was you and Salvatore Felica
Jeff.
and Jeff Fallis who did a pre-recorded video. So then hopefully what I said was reasonably intelligent, but that's really the secret, is getting smart people around
Well,
you.
first of all, imposter syndrome. We all have it. I mean, except for one person in particular that is annoying, but everyone else is just like and we know who that is. But yeah, we just do research. I mean, I remember when I started writing online, it's like, and luckily we have Expecting Rain as a platform or
Right.
to share things. And I just started writing. It's like, wow, people like it, and it took me, and then so fooled you, fooled everybody.
Actually, it's funny. I had actually done the Dylan and Comics presentation in 2017 or 20. I don't know. Somehow, at one point, I was invited to the Sherwin Miller Museum of Jewish Art in Tulsa. Which, believe it or not, there's a
Tulsa.
Museum of Jewish Art in Tulsa, and
Before it was hip.
Exactly. And I work with the Will Eisner Studios and Foundation. They're the family of this pioneering graphic novelist named Will Eisner, and I helped them run something called Will Eisner Week. And so they were having an event about Eisner and graphic novels at the museum, and they invited me down to speak. And I said, well, as long as I'm here. I think at that point I knew that Tulsa had been picked as where the Dylan Center would be, and the Woody Guthrie Center was already there. So I did sort of a rough version of my Dylan and Comics presentation. So I've done it a couple of times, including, I think I even did it in Minneapolis. Because why not go to the belly of the beast and say, "Oh, you guys, here, I'll tell you stuff about Bob Dylan you didn't know."
As when I was looking for some stuff, I mean, I have a few of my own comics.
Oh, okay, you got right. Those are the main. Yeah, yeah.
It's a lot shorter than most of the biographies of Bob Dylan.
Yes, but I love those covers, especially. They're really terrific covers on those comics.
And I know I have National Lampoons with Zimmerman.
Yeah, that was an interesting moment in Lampoon and in Dylan history.
So um,
Oh, what's the thing? There's a lot of Dylan in comics. There's not that much comics in Dylan. That was my challenge, putting the presentation together.
Well, comic book and me, that's what you called it. Comic book and me, and just us, we called the bus.
Well, that's one of them. And my favorite is all right, what are we, like 10 minutes in and I'm about to do a Dylan imitation. So all right, I guess there was one episode of Theme Time Radio Hour that was not about comics, but somehow he was talking about that. He got talking about Batman, and maybe somehow in 1939, Bob Kane. He didn't mention Bill Finger, who was the equally important co-creator. I find Dylan's comic knowledge is not always, like, it's sort of, if I ever wondered if Dylan was more than just a kid, I'm sure Dylan read comics as a kid, like every kid did in the 40s and 50s. But there are some things that he says about comics that lead me to indicate that it's not. I don't see it as a passion of his. Somewhere I heard a rumor he owned a comic book shop. I've never been able to corroborate that. But there's an episode and he says Batman was created in 1939, Detective Comics 27, and he says I couldn't to be Superman. He had to be from another planet, but I could be Batman, and I tried. Yeah, so And so there's some few and far between, and of course there's the Joker Man video,
Right.
which has the Joker in it, and
Mm.
the Shot of Love cover is kind of in a comic booky look. But Dylan is, he knows so much other stuff. I'll forgive him, but he doesn't strike me as someone who's particularly interested in the world of comics and graphic novels.
Um, and so let's see. You're on a, right. So you did your panel with Harry Hugh and Daniel Radish of the
Right, two
Daily
in
Show,
yeah,
and
two funny guys, and I had to follow them.
it was a great presentation. I was there. No, I loved it. I mean, to see all that stuff, all the stuff one. I mean, all that stuff one after another. There's, I mean, do you know how many slides you had? It was quite a few.
I had a lot, and then of course afterwards I realized I had a few more, and I think I'd maybe accidentally used a slightly different version of my PowerPoint than, but yeah, again, if you're looking for it, it's not so much Dylan talking about comics, but other people talk. I found there was well, the thing I took comics to include action, adventure, and animation and kids. So I found one thing literally the day before the panel. Those I would think this audience, if any audience, knows the line from my own version of You that refers to a robot commando.
Yeah.
And I'll take the Scarface Pacino and the Godfather Brando, mix them up and get a robot commando. Something made me think, robot commando, something sounds vaguely familiar. It doesn't, it's obviously it's Dylan, so it's not just a chance combination of words. Let me see what happens when I Google Robot Commando. Well, Robot Commando was a toy that came out in 1961. So I was 7 or 8 years old. And it was this really, clunky. It was a robot. It was a robot that fired missiles, and so there's this the commercial for it is online, and I play, and it's this very what looks now very campy commercial, um, and I played it, and it was the perfect audience to play it for, and my theory about it, based on no fact at all, just sort of that it appeared in 1961 on a kid's like Saturday morning cartoon show.
Mm-hmm.
Commercial made me think, sort of made me imagine, here's Dylan out after a night of, performing and hanging out and partying. And it's like, 8 in the morning and he, staggers into whatever couch he's crashing on and turns on the TV to relax. And there's this robot commando. And somehow that stuck with him for the past 60 years. That's based on no fact, on nothing Dylan or anybody else has ever said, but it just seems to me like a plausible scenario. Otherwise, why would he even put that in the song?
Exactly. Well, you make it. You're like you're apologizing, like none of us ever do things based on no facts. I mean, it's what it's like. Well, this could be it as long as we don't say definitively.
Yeah.
Even
Right,
if even
exactly.
if Dylan said it, it's not a reliable source. I mean,
They talk about unreliable narrators, right? Well, having spent a long time in the various rabbit holes of the Kennedy assassination, yes, there's nothing, yeah, a lot of stuff is based on supposition and plausible but not provable leaps in logic and so on. Yeah, so that I wasn't so much apologizing as just reflecting on. I was amusing myself and hopefully somebody else in the audience too.
Yeah, I mean that's what I did. Just sit there, like put things together. Sometimes I look it up. Sometimes it's memory. If it's wrong, someone will tell me. Certainly.
Yeah, just so I put together. I worked hard. I borrowed a lot of Brian Cronin's research and and probably some of Rob Kelly's and probably some other people's. Um, yeah, and I have to say it was, when you follow two very funny people, um, the fear is that that's where the expression "that's a tough act to follow" comes from. But luckily, they kind of warmed up the audience. I felt that I felt the audience was, was very receptive to me, and maybe more so than they would have been if I had just had, a panel devoted to just Dylan and comic books. So I was worked out very well.
Yeah, I can testify. Testify. I can confirm that yes, it went over very well. So the more complete titles of some of the things you wrote. So it's Superman on the Couch, What Superheroes Really Tell Us About Ourselves and Our Society, and Disguised as Clark Kent is Jews, Comics, and the Creation of the Superhero. And the other one is A Marvelous Life, The Amazing Story of Stan Lee. So they're not just like, comic book things. They're not just for the comics, but it's a bigger view, an overall world view kind of
Right.
comics and what they mean, because they're like they're like the Rodney Dangerfield of art. They don't get no respect. So I was wondering, just in general, what I mean, those are three books right there, and they cover a lot. But just in general, your take on comics and maybe the world view and your view and why they might be more important than people who dismiss them.
Wow. Okay. Well, it's funny. I was gonna something we were talking about before made me think of. Oh, when we were talking about our names, about
Mm,
there's a 3-page story, maybe 4 page. I think it's 3 pages by Harvey P. Carr and Robert Crumb called the Harvey P. Carr Name Story,
mhm,
and it's pretty well known. If you Google it, you can probably find all 3 or 4. I think it's 3 pages.
mhm,
And it's a story. It's Robert Crumb drawing. It's almost like a stand-up comedy routine with Crumb drawing Harvey P. Carr, who was a jazz critic and comic book writer and one of the innovators of the independent comics movement, although he himself was not an artist, but brilliant writer. Um, and he did a comic called American Splendor that came out that published mostly by himself, then by DC Comics and Dark Horse Comics. But it's Crumb. Harvey is talking about what would seem to be a very not interesting topic about how he was the only Harvey P. Carr in the Cleveland phone book, and then a second one showed up, and it perturbed him, and all these different kind of um, weird but insightful reflections about it, and then that third one, it's it shouldn't work. It's just a guy looking into the kind of the camera, sort of, and
mhm,
talking, and it breaks every rule of storytelling, but it's really just a terrific story. So and I think it demonstrates, when I teach comics writing, I always have people, you know, read it, because I say this breaks every rule that I'm going to, or it seems to break every rule that I'm going to, lay down for you about how most comics are made. Obviously, rules are made to be broken and all that. Um, I loved comics my whole life. I was the perfect generation for the first flight of the Marvel comics, and for underground comics and independent comics, and people like Will Eisner and Harvey P. Carr and Trina Robbins and on and on. Um, and I worked at Marvel Comics as a writer and editor for 18 years. So I know how the sausage is made. I know all the fanish stuff. I know I know probably less about the minutia of continuity than a lot of people, but I certainly know plenty of it. I was the editor of Spider-Man comics for a number of years. I wrote a lot of stories of characters, famous and not so famous. And so what I brought to my books was that insider's point of view. And and um, and I felt that there had not certainly there had, oddly enough, although in the 40s and 50s there were prominent psychiatrists and psychologists debating the merits or demerits of comics. Most famously, a guy named Frederick Wortham, who wrote a book called Seduction of the Innocent, which is so funny, because in itself that's like a real kind of sensationalistic title. He wrote a book called Seduction of the Innocent about the evils of the 50s comics, the horror comics and the crime comics and the superhero comics. Wortham was a fascinating guy. he was actually a progressive politically, very liberal to radical, and he really saw comic books as almost like a part of the capitalist consumer machine, turning kids into zombie automatons who would be prey to fascist autocrats and ruthless capitalist publishers. But he found himself in bed with a lot of right wing and religious zealots and conservatives in opposing comic books. So that was a very weird period. But there had been no, I could not find any psychiatrist or psychologist since Wortham who'd written about comic books. And I'm not one, but I've had, you know, one, two, or perhaps 1,000 therapy sessions myself. So I thought I, you know, had some insight into what therapy was and how it would apply to superheroes. And so I wrote this book, you know, a sociological and psychological examination of what makes superheroes tick, why people love them, what, you know, what Wortham maybe got right as far as the dangers of creating a universe where might makes right, but what maybe he missed about having characters who are idealistic and and uh, and hold up a certain sense of positive values and yet are flawed, and especially the way the Marvel characters were. So that was one book, and then that was the Superman on the couch, and then disguised as Clark Kent. Um, that I can't say was the only book. That somehow that year there were that within like a year period there were like 3 books about Jews and superheroes. I like to think mine was the best, but you know I would. Um, and and um, and it had to do you know, sort of a deeper dive into the Superman on the couch thing about you know the Jewish immigrants, the children of Jewish immigrants who largely were responsible for creating the main superheroes in the 40s and in the 30s and 40s, and then again in the 60s with the Marvel comics. And again, bringing and in both, and especially in that book, I also included independent and underground comics. You know, I talk about Spiegelman and Pekar and Will Eisner, as well as Siegel and Schuster, who created Superman, and Bob Kane and Bill Finger with Batman, and Lee and Kirby with most of the Marvel heroes. You know, Steve Ditko with Spider-Man, Doctor Strange, who was not Jewish, but you know, don't hold that against him. The Spider-Man was still pretty damn good. So so that was that book, and then sort of the Stan Lee biography. Um, you know, there have been others before and since. Again, I think what I brought to the table on that was having worked in the comics business for years and years, having knowing Stan, being friendly with him, but not being in his inner circle. I, you know, I think I did you know, in some, you know, most people think of Stan Lee as that lovable old guy who does the cameos in the Marvel movies and TV shows. He was more controversial than that in a way, not unlike Bob Dylan can be controversial, you know, and I can already hear people out there going, Dylan is nothing like Stan. What are you talking about? But you know, there are certainly plenty of people, you know, for all his accomplishments and talent, will, you know, eager to somehow diminish Dylan's accomplishments. He didn't write that. He stole that from this person. He blah blah, you know, on and on, and it's not even not true. But you know, he's still friggin' Bob Dylan, and Stanley still friggin' you know. I mean, I think they have, when you get that high profile, you have people taking pot shots at you, and maybe they're even right, you know, but that doesn't discredit your entire career or body of work. You know, so Stanley was controversial in an analogous way, especially because he himself was not an artist. He worked with, you know, incredibly talented artists who also did a lot of the creating and co-creating and store, you know. Anyway, so I thought, looking at Stan Lee as somebody, obviously I couldn't, you know, he was one of a kind. Um, but having been a writer and editor in comics, and at Marvel Comics in particular, I thought gave me some insight into him and his accomplishments and the controversy surrounding him. So that was my attempt. Needless to say, not everybody agrees I did that, but that was that was another book told from the sausage making floor.
All right. Just on a side note, so there was DC and Marvel when you were a kid. Did you read both of them, or did you favor one, or do you like Superman versus Batman, or?
Well, I mean, it's fun. I mean, it's interesting you say that because there were DC, Marvel, and 20 other companies. But of course, in
Right.
the superhero world,
Mm.
yes, it came down to DC and Marvel. I read them both. The first Marvels came out when I was 8, 9, 10 years old, and I'd been reading comics since I was 5. So when you're right, imagine when you're a kid, when you're 9 years old, so 3 years, 3, 4 years is a large part of your life. So I felt jaded and like I knew everything, and there was nothing anybody could tell me. But these Marvel comics were revolutionary to a kid. I know it's a word that's used a lot, but just the sensibility, whatever the combination of Stan and the artists, and just the look and feel. They were even printed on cheaper paper, and they literally had a kind of a much rougher, grittier feel that it was part of it. And then Stan as the editor also speaking to the readers and the letters pages. So I very soon realized I preferred the Marvels, and then became just a simple economic decision. As Marvel increased its line to more and more superheroes, um, I just in my kid economy where you have to make room for like pizza, candy, and comic books. So at a certain point, I did stop buying the DC comics, and I went all in on the Marvels. And then I did stop reading superhero comics, as a teenager, for reasons I think having to do with me as just growing up or whatever I was doing, and with the comics themselves. 'Cause I think they had lapsed into a sort of formula, um, and they weren't surprising me anymore.
Did you save them all?
No, no,
We won't go
well,
there.
at various points,
Uh-huh.
I attempted maturity. So remember giving a lot of comics away, and then clearly I was not, you know, I don't think anybody, but certainly I didn't have any understanding of I used to store my comics on top of the radiator, which is not recommended. So even a lot of the comics that I do still have from
Yeah.
my childhood are really crumbling. It's you know, well loved and well read, but not in mint condition.
Well, that's what they're supposed to be anyway. You're supposed to just, read them anyway. It's like unopened vinyl records or whatever that you don't listen to.
Right.
So I was thinking like so where you went next, it reminds me of like Truman Capote go from Breakfast to Tiffany's to In Cold Blood. You go from superheroes to an anti-hero. I don't know if anti-hero is a proper term, but Jack Ruby.
Yeah.
So uh, and I'll be in the blog that goes with this. I'm going to link to the your interview on Rob Kelly's Pod Dylan podcast because you go into even more depth there. But and but you so there are a lot of things to ask about this book, but one of the things in your interview with Rob Kelly is about a certain comedian and actor Buddy Hackett that you told the story, which I thought was pretty funny.
Well, I mean, the story's not so much about Buddy Hackett. The book is called Jack Ruby: The Many Faces of Oswald's Assassin, and I can I'll backtrack and answer what I think was your question, but
Yeah.
a lot of Ruby was very Jewish identified, for better or worse, um, and came from the same kind of background as Stan Lee and um, Bob Dylan's parents and my parents and aunts and uncles. It was a very familiar. I sometimes call Ruby's story a greatest generation story going horribly wrong. Guy's born in 1911. So what? In my research, and again, I'll backtrack and tell you how I got to from comics to him. But in my research, I discovered there was a rabbi named Hillel Silverman, who was who was Jack's rabbi in Dallas. He was the rabbi of the synagogue Ruby belonged to. You may know his son, a guy named Jonathan Silverman, who starred in A Weekend at Bernie's. That's the son. That's Jack Ruby's rabbi's son. And so Hillel Silverman, uh, who just died like 6 months ago, he was at age 99. He visited Jack pretty much every other day for 4 months in prison, from like the day, maybe a day or two after Ruby killed Oswald. Spoiler alert: Ruby killed Oswald. And, and
Or did he? No, that's the wrong guy.
well, that's one thing we know for sure. So maybe from a day or two after Ruby killed Oswald for like the next 4 months, and then he moved to a pulpit in Los Angeles. He was burned out, and he was sort of on this career track as a rabbi. And he took elaborate notes because he was planning to write a book, which he didn't write that book. But he did write a memoir, which is sort of how I discovered him. And then I ended up interviewing him because I was able, he was public, and he had actually played himself in a movie about the assassination in 1978, directed by Stan Lee's cousin.
It's all connected.
Yeah,
It's a conspiracy.
Mel Stewart. But so the Buddy Hackett. So what I say, and I'm pretty sure it's true. My joke used to be, oh yeah, then he went to L.A. and became Buddy Hackett's rabbi, because that was like the funniest name I could think of. But then I did a little more research, and it turned out he really did become Buddy Hackett's rabbi. So that was where Buddy Hackett comes into the.
Yeah, I guess there was a bit of a jump there to go into that before explaining more about the book. So I want you to say like how your whole history of how you came to write this book, how the whole research thing.
Well, yeah, it's definitely a departure. About 12 years ago, leading up to the 50th anniversary of the assassination, I was never somebody who was obsessed with the Kennedy assassination, because it really hurt my head to think about it, because there was, once you get into anything that's not the Warren Commission, which is plenty flawed, then suddenly you're in the world of different theories and ideas. And the problem is not that there's not enough information. The problem is there are these endless tsunamis of information. There's this endless data and information, and you can prove, as we know, there's a bunch of theories that are not crazy, that make perfect sense, and that are, quote unquote, provable, except that they all, to me anyway, they almost all require some kind of leap of logic or leap of faith of, or just an assumption about what something would do or how something would play out. So I never delved particularly deeply into it, but obviously it was like the major event of my childhood. I was literally 10 years old when both those killings happened. And so in like the year or two leading up to the 50th anniversary, I wanted to I was interested in doing a graphic novel project. And I thought, gee, it would be interesting to do a biography, interesting doing something relating to the Kennedy assassination, simply because the 50th anniversary was coming up. And the more I researched it, I saw, okay, here's this Jack Ruby guy, and with, my interest in what could be termed eccentric, idiosyncratic, strange, influential American Jews, I thought, well, this is my angle. This is my entry into the Kennedy assassination story. And so that's what I did. I was put together by a packager, a brilliant editor that I'd worked with named Howard Zimmerman. Some of you may know from his work on Starlog. I met him when I worked for a guy named Byron Price. Howard was packaging graphic novels, and I told him what I wanted to do, and he liked the idea, and he put me together with an artist named Rick Geary, who some of you may know. If you don't know his name, you know his work. And Rick is still doing a lot of independent comic work, a lot of true murder stuff that he writes himself. So we got together. I wrote up an elaborate proposal. I wrote a 180-page script. Rick did a bunch of sample pages that looked terrific, and then for various reasons, we were not, we had publishers who were interested, but we couldn't get an advance that would really make it worth Rick spending 2 years drawing nothing but this. So just kind of backburnered it. And then 2 or 3 years ago, I said, now that I'd written these other books, and especially the Stanley biography, I thought, gee, what if I could transform the Ruby graphic novel into a prose biography? Could we find a publisher? And we did, Chicago Review Press. And then I had to do a lot more research, and a lot more interviewing, and just writing. It's a whole different approach. And there were things that I discovered this time around, that that made me question even a lot of my own assumptions about Ruby and the assassination from 10 years ago. So that's how that happened. Chicago Review Press wanted, and then of course they wanted it very quickly because that's how publishing works. But luckily I had 10 years worth of research, and then so, and again, another spoiler alert, I do not solve the mysteries of the Kennedy assassination. I'm not that smart. But what I could do is interview people like, and so the Rabbi Silverman gave me access to the notes he took while visiting Jack in prison every other day for 4 months. Because he said, I'm old, I'm not writing my book anymore. Do you want to see my notes? I said, yeah, I wouldn't mind. He sends me his notes, complete with the rusty paper clips from 1964, 63. And so, I don't, I'm sure other people have seen them, but I don't think anybody made the extensive use of them that I did, intercutting them with the trial transcript and current events and interviews with Ruby's family. I spoke to his niece and nephew, who heretofore had not been very forthcoming. It's kind of a weird thing to be Jack Ruby's niece or nephew, right? I spoke to the children of the other strip club owners in Dallas. It was kind of a Jewish business in Dallas. So I thought that's my angle, like Superman on the Couch, like the Stan Lee book, to try to find what maybe made this guy tick, and what of the various motivations ascribed to him, and of the many motivations he himself claimed. Because unlike Oswald had 2 days. This was like this is a thing. While I'm not advocating any particular conspiracy theory, because none of them have particularly convinced me, I have to say, in 1963, I did not come from a wealthy family, and yet we had a tape recorder. Many people I know in 1963 who were not wealthy had tape recorders at home, because you want to, for the obvious reasons, to record family events, or relatives, or radio, or music off the radio. Um, who didn't have a tape recorder in 1963? The Dallas Police Department. So that seemed a little, so I'm just saying, they didn't have one. Nobody thought to walk the 2 blocks over to a department store to buy one. So there's no actual recorded record of anything. Anything that we know that Oswald allegedly said is either what he said in those impromptu press conferences, including "I'm a patsy," the most famous,
Right.
or what other people reported he said. On the other hand, Jack Ruby lived for 3 years and would not shut up. You couldn't make, including his lawyers couldn't make him shut up. He did not go on the stand because they didn't want him to even, incriminate himself even worse than killing Oswald on live television. But Ruby would have impromptu news conferences at recesses during the trial. He would just talk to anybody and everybody, including the guards watching him in prison, doctors, psychiatrists, But of course, what he said, it seemed to me, unless you're looking to cherry pick what he said for a specific agenda one might have, he just contradicted himself and was all over the map. It was fascinating. It was almost Shakespearean, in that way, that sort of the way gangsters talk is sometimes has that sort of strange, back alley literary quality to it.
He reminds me of someone's been in the news a lot the last 5 years. So.
Well, there you go. It's
Or more.
yes, except Jack Ruby wasn't running, wasn't attempting to run a country. It was all, and that was the thing about. I mean, Ruby actually had these men. I mean, the book is called "The Many Faces of Oswald's Assassin" because he displayed, you know, so many different personalities. Um, just and again, I think the rabbi. I guess look, there's always something performative when you're talking to somebody in public, even if it's this guy and your rabbi who you trust. But and again, the thing about Ruby and Oswald, they were both nuts. Whether they were lone nuts will always be the question.
Right.
But they both had lifetime histories of erratic and irrational and violent behavior. Um, so the so that's how I came to write the book, and I just feel maybe like with Stan Lee, I just feel like, okay, some people think Stan was the devil, and other people think he was an angel close to heaven, and he and he was a complicated person, and Ruby was too. I mean, Ruby would display just a lot of he was um, seemed to be afraid that he had started another Holocaust by killing Oswald, that he thought he was kind of almost doing public relations for the Jews, and ended up starting the second Holocaust. I mean, he had all these delusions, and you could say, well, he was making it up. But he really had to be the world's greatest actor, and yet he is still the guy who walked up and at point blank range shot the guy who should have been the most heavily guarded person in the world. So I mean, there's a certain despite all his screw ups and his history of business and romantic and interpersonal failures, fact is this guy could be very competent at times.
So what are your personal memories of November 22nd, 63, and that time frame?
I say this, I guess my story is me saying I need to come up with a better story. It's fun. I mean, I was going to a Jewish day school. I was going to yeshiva in New
Hmm.
York City. So
Hmm.
we had already gotten out because a lot of people remember as they were in school and somebody came in and said the president's been murdered, school's out for the day, and everybody hugging each other. We had already, it was an hour later in New York than it was in Dallas. So we'd been let out. We had a half day. Don't get so jealous because we would go till 5:30 the rest of the week. But we had it on Fridays when it got dark early for the Sabbath. We would get out early. But because I lived 5 blocks from my school, I didn't have to travel any distance. So I was out with a friend buying used comic books. Big surprise, right?
It's all connected.
Yeah. Well, when you exactly when that those were the days, children, when used comic books were cheaper than when they were nickel because they were used. Who would want an old comic book? Um, so I was out buying used comic books, and I was with a friend of mine, and we were walking up East 86th Street in Manhattan because I lived in Manhattan, and ran into some friends from school who told that you know uh, my memory, which I realized maybe 2 or 3 years ago, could not be correct. My memory is that I thought my classmate had said, "Did you hear Kenny was shot in Dallas?" And my joke about it, my dark humor joke about it always was, what was our friend Kenny doing in Dallas, and who would want to shoot him? But I've thought back, and I don't think I went to school with anybody named Kenny, so I don't know why I remember. And then of course a second later, the guy said, "No, no, Kennedy was shot in Dallas." you know.
Well, as I said when I on the panel we were on, my memory for years is I pictured a TV. It was three white letters on a black background, but it was um, FDR. And I think the only reason I thought that is because we probably learned the initials FDR in school, and it had to have been JFK just because of where we were living at the time and how young I was, and just nothing was on TV other than the
Well,
coverage
that's
of.
it. yeah, that's the other thing I remember. Yeah, as a kid, your memory is there was nothing else on TV. Right, because all your shows were not there, and it was just, it was the first 24-hour anything on news, right? When you and I were kids, they could fit all the news in 15 minutes, right? Between 11 and 11:15. I got to stay up late. My father worked nights. So if I wanted to see my dad, I had to stay. That was the beginning of like my lifetime insomnia, you know. So if I wanted to see my father, I had to stay up. So the rule was, yeah, I could watch the news and Johnny Carson's monologue, but then
Ah.
I had a strict after Johnny's monologue bedtime, which was at 11:15 because all the news fit into 15 minutes. And Johnny, or before him, I guess it was Jack Parr, but whoever was doing the monologue on the Tonight Show. Um, uh, so yeah, there was no 20. I mean, neither, and then of course, um, you know, I do not know if I saw the live shooting of Oswald or just saw it on a video replay. But yeah, that was yeah, and that whole weekend was just so. I mean, so that's sort of in a way the point of view I got in the book, where I spoke to Ruby's niece and nephew. So I mean, imagine you live in Dallas, you're 12 years old, your name is Ruby, and your uncle owns a strip club. And you've been telling all your friends because you're 12 years old and your uncle owns a strip club, and then your crazy uncle or your eccentric uncle kills Oswald on television, changes history forever, starts 1,000 conspiracy theories, and then you got to go to school. Not Monday, I guess. I think the schools are closed, but Tuesday you got to go to school. That was not very pleasant for that kid who's now,
Yeah.
60 years, and is a 70-something-year-old man. So, those that's the kind of thing I tried to get at. The rabbi's point, just sort of because Ruby didn't, Ruby did not just emerge out of the sky to kill Oswald. He had a whole life, and I guess the thing that maybe even connects Ruby to Dylan is that they were both in show business. Ruby, you can just see he's a guy who, um, in a different lifetime, he was his own MC, he was his own bouncer, which led to him being in a lot of violent uh, interactions with customers that he would then suddenly seem to wake up out of a fugue state. He'd be beating somebody's head into the pavement and then suddenly go, "What am I doing?" But he owned country western clubs. Something that's now called the Longhorn Ballroom, and back in the 50s was called the Bob Wills Roadhouse. Ruby took over and managed that place. He would wear a white cowboy suit and have a pair of six shooters and introduce himself as the Chicago Cowboy. He had, he managed a number of entertainers. There was one in particular who I write about in the book named Little Daddy Nelson. He was a 12-year-old African American kid, who was by all accounts, a terrific singer and dancer. And Ruby thought this kid was going to be his ticket out of the dumps and up into the upper realms of show business. And then there was suddenly, just as the kid was getting a little successful, suddenly a second woman showed up claiming to be his mother and not the one who brought him to Ruby's attention. So that ruined that whole. So there's a lot of, like in everybody's life, but Ruby had a bunch of those. Gee, what if Jack Ruby had been successful in show business? Jack Ruby, the last person to give Hank Williams Sr. regular work. When Williams was on kind of a downward spiral, due to illness and medication and alcohol and whatever else, when he was undependable and nobody else would hire him, Jack Ruby hired him. But they had this love-hate thing because Ruby was crazy and a pain in the ass, and so Williams kind of needed him, but didn't. He didn't want. He didn't want to be part of Jack Ruby's inner circle, so he would kind of dodge Ruby. He would check into hotels under false names so Ruby wouldn't. But and then Ruby, again it was never all black and white. If and when Hank Williams would black out, I guess not if, but when Hank Williams would black out backstage and not be able to go on, to recoup his loss, Ruby would then charge fans to go backstage and take pictures of blacked out Hank Williams. So it was, yeah. So there's a lot
Colonel
of.
Tom's got nothing on this guy.
Oh, really? And again, because of the business he was in, and because he was kind of conscious of his status in the community, in the Jewish community, and the Dallas community, and the entertainment community, there's a lot of names you would not think would show up in the Jack Ruby story. New York Yankees superstar Mickey Mantle lived next door to Ruby's synagogue and was friends with the rabbi. So I don't know if Ruby ever met him, but Mickey Mantle fits. Just these people fit in the Jack Ruby story. That Robbie Robertson and the band when they were the Hawks.
Right, that was going to ask you next, because it's obviously mentioned in The Last Waltz that there's Robbie's take. I think Levon maybe even had a slightly different take on the story. I'm not sure,
Yeah,
but anyway. So what did you find out about that whole thing?
Well, I mean, Ruby, there was, I think Ruby had, when you say somebody owned a place, it's always ambiguous. Whether I don't think they owned the real estate, but Ruby ran nightclubs of various kinds, but from the strip club to the country western club. He ran a movie theater for a time. It's fine. On my list, I was in Dallas just on November 20th. Speaking to an event sponsored by the Dallas Jewish Historical Society and the Sixth Floor Museum. And
The Sixth Floor Museum. I mean, is that the
Sixth Floor Museum is the former book depository, which is now and an archive, where they have thousands of interviews with people, even remotely connected, including me, which I thought was weird, but okay, I guess I'm now remotely connected to the events of that weekend, which is
now I'm connected to you, so therefore I'm connected.
Although who didn't want to be interviewed was Stan Lee. I figured, wow, I bet Stan would love to be interviewed, and he has some stories about that weekend, but he turned out he didn't, which I thought was interesting. But so
I'm sure he has an alibi.
or had one. No, he was in New York. I think that's well established. So Ruby, he was somehow involved in managing a place called the Skyline or the Skyliner Lounge out on like a very rowdy, on the Jack Sparrow Freeway, it was called. Apparently a very rowdy strip of brothels and nightclubs and saloons, and the band and then the Hawks were booked to play at this venue, and then they get there, and the place, I don't think it was called the Skyline for this reason, but
I thought it was called the Skylight Lounge. Is it the Skyline?
The Skyliner, and maybe the Skylight too.
Right. Okay.
Every source I looked at had a different name, but
it's like the Comac Arena, if you remember that.
Is that in the Long Island? Is that
there was the Suffolk Forum, the Suffolk Arena,
right.
Comac. Anyway, go ahead. I digress.
Or like the Felt Forum in New York, which has 100 different names, right?
Exactly.
So they get there, and the place literally has no roof. It had a fire, and the roof is gone. But they're still using it as a dance and party venue, and they go, okay, we're getting paid, and then they meet the manager, who, Robbie describes him in testimony in his autobiography as like a guy clearly high on amphetamines, which Ruby often was, and sort of gruff, not so much, not so lovable, but gruff and business, and he said to them, well, you can see we don't have a roof here, so if you guys, I'd advise you to sleep here overnight with your instruments if you don't want them to get stolen, before tomorrow night's gig. But I guess they were getting paid, and they played the gig, and then it was just a very odd. The crowd was very strange. There was like a one-armed go-go dancer, and the fights breaking out. But they survived, and they played, and they did get paid, and then a few months later, they see, Oswald's been killed, and there's that weird guy Jack who was managing that club we played in. So that they, I think a lot of people had that happened who would work, who had worked for Ruby's clubs.
Um, so I would imagine in some ways immediately there was some people thought, wow, thank God Ruby killed Oswald and we have to go through a trial, and other people were thinking this is not the way America should be run or something. Do you go into that at all, the
Yeah,
reaction?
I do. Well, it seemed, I mean, I think everybody was shocked. I mean,
They were still
uh,
in shock probably, and then doubly
in
shocked.
shock.
Yeah.
And I think one of the reasons he was able, everybody knew Jack Ruby. He was a denizen of downtown Dallas. So people, I mean, because sometimes people will say to me, how did Jack Ruby get in there? And there's a bunch of theories. And yet that seemed to me like Jack Ruby made it his business to be known to everybody, especially the police. And there were different theories. Some people think it was just so his club wouldn't get closed down if there were any violations of any drinking or nudity laws. There are other people who think he was a conduit for drug smuggling that involved the police. That's what whatever it was, he was very well known. So that Jack Ruby could, and he loved to be where the action was. So that Ruby would be in that room, to me, didn't seem so shocking. And I think the police wanted to show that room was filled with police and with reporters from all over the world. And I think the police wanted to show that they had not been beating Oswald up. I think they had, like, the first, you can see Oswald did have some puffiness, and because he looked like he'd been beat up, but at least they weren't beating him up too badly. You know, they wanted to show that they had nothing to hide. And so I think that, you know, is what enabled Ruby to get up so close to him and shoot him. And then I used to think, and maybe this is still part of the truth, is that Ruby kind of assumed that, not unlike in Godfather 2 when Hyman Roth gets assassinated. I think Ruby thought that he would get killed. I think he wanted to commit what's called suicide by cop.
Yeah.
But if you look at the video, you can see everything happened too fast. Plus, I think the police were being gun shy. They literally were gun shy. They had just had the president assassinated in their city. Here's a room full of reporters. Let's not accidentally kill a. So but Ruby did get tackled like a second after he shot Oswald. He's tackled by reporters and police. While shouting out, "You all know me. I'm Jack Ruby." As if I wouldn't kill this guy if he didn't need killing. Although he'd never been arrested or convicted really for murder. He was once, booked or just questioned in a murder, and he did seem to be in rooms where a lot of rooms where people got killed. But he himself was not known as a hit. He was known as a violent guy,
Hmm.
including like beating up Nazis in the 30s in Chicago. But he was not. But anyway, he yeah. So there was a contingent of people who sent him congratulatory telegrams. But I think anybody who put any thought into it realized, oh shit, now we're never going to know. We're never going to hear anything from Oswald. But he was looked at as a hero in certain quarters and got a lot of fan mail. But at a certain point, somehow, and this is, having been 10 years old, and I have to take people's word for it because I don't, my memory and is not clear, but it did seem that the public consciousness almost seemed to blame him for killing Kennedy. It almost seemed like he and Oswald became mushed together
Yeah, they
in the
conflated them. Yeah, all part of the same thing.
right?
Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. So, um, yeah, and I can see how that would happen. But yeah, but for a while he was seen as a hero. Um, but yeah, but of course he made it impossible. There have been, from the second Kennedy was shot, there were conspiracy theories. I mean, it didn't take 10 minutes for them to start. And then as soon as Ruby killed Oswald, well, then they multiplied 100-fold, but he did make it impossible to ever know. Um, so I think he went from being a kind of looked at as a hero to being looked at as a villain. And I think he was, the trial happened really remarkably quickly. The assassination, he killed Oswald on November 24th, and the trial started on March 4th. So that's, I mean, 3 months later. I mean, that would never happen now. I mean, and it was the biggest circus trial until the Chicago 7 or Chicago 8 trial. It wasn't televised, um, but reporters were all over the place, and including both TV news and radio and newspapers, and all sorts of crazy stuff happened during the trial. And the Ruby family, they hired and fired lawyers like it was going out of style, but they did it. The most high profile lawyer they had was this guy Melvin Belli, who at the time was the most famous lawyer in America.
Mhm.
The people say he had never done a murder trial before. I don't think that's true. I think he had defended uh, he had been defense counsel in one or two murders, but not a lot. It wasn't his specialty was consumer advocacy. People who've gotten hurt by like bottles of soda or by appliances they'd bought, and he did. He was really considered. He was considered sort of a showboat and a show off and an egotistical, but a very effective lawyer. And and the Ruby family. I mean, talk about some other. The Ruby family found him because Ruby's brother Earl, who was kind of the most successful of the brothers, he had a dry cleaning business in Detroit. Um, Earl had gone to high school with an executive at Frank Sinatra's Reprise record label. And so Earl went out. I mean, there's a lot of different versions of the story, but basically, Earl flies out to LA because Ruby had been trying to get a hold of Sinatra for various reasons before the assassination to help him straighten out issues he was having with the Performers Union. And he never got to Sinatra. He got to Joey Adams. If anybody isn't a fan of old time comedy, you may know Joey Adams. Probably know his wife, Cindy Adams, the gossip columnist. So his widow, Cindy Adams. So Earl flies out to LA to see a guy named Mike Shore, who was, you know, probably pretty mobbed up, and he was an executive of Reprise Records. And I think Shore is the one who connected him to Melvin Belli. So there's a lot of very odd confluences of show business and politics and history. Yeah.
And so in the middle of all this, so when you were writing, you said you had 10 years of research, and then took a break, whatever, until you picked up again. In the middle of all this, Bob Dylan drops "Murder Most Foul." So that must have been odd. I mean, it's odd for everybody, but it must have been especially odd for you.
It was especially odd for me. That was let me see, because I hadn't signed the deal for the book yet. And I knew Dylan, I guess Murder Most Foul did demonstrate Dylan has a certain obsession with it. Dylan would say, Dylan's most famous thing he said about the Kennedy assassination was in 1971. I think he said to Anthony Scaduto, if I had anything important to say about the Kennedy assassination, don't you think I would have said it by now? But to me, the most interesting thing related to Dylan, and it's footage you can see in No Direction Home, the Scorsese movie, where during the tour, I guess in '66, somebody comes to tell Dylan that somebody's threatened to assassinate him on stage. And Dylan says something like, "I don't mind somebody taking a shot at me. I just don't want to know about it." Right? And then his bandmates are kind of quietly freaking out, especially Mickey Jones, who was the drummer at that time.
Mm-hmm.
who's got a great, actually, if you ever seen Mickey Jones shot 8mm movies of that tour, it's a
Yeah.
great video if you get to see it. But Dylan says, and this is really, he says, Mickey is like nervous, I don't know if you hear what he says, but Dylan says to him, "Don't worry, Mickey, I'll protect you." And you go, how the hell is this? What does that even mean? But you get the feeling yes, it's partly a joke, but you definitely get the feeling that Dylan believes that he could somehow protect this guy if somebody starts shooting at them on stage. So that to me was maybe the most interesting kind of assassination related thing that Dylan had said or done. He said other things, and obviously when I started researching for this panel, um, but then yeah, Murder Most Foul comes out, and it's like, well, okay, that's for all the reasons Murder Most Foul is interesting, and then for me personally, like, oh gee, I've had this graphic novel and then this book proposal going around for years, and suddenly and I knew that Dylan had done a bunch of artwork. A lot of his paintings or collages had riffed on Ruby in particular, and interestingly, he did a riff on the famous Ruby shooting Oswald photo. That's nowhere. You cannot find that online. I don't know if they had copyright issues with using that. Whatever it was, you cannot find, or I cannot find that photo. But I know I saw it. It was in the Gagosian show in 2012 in New York.
Mhm.
But there are like 3 or 4 other artworks Dylan has done that riff on Ruby or Oswald. But yeah, that song was 17 minutes. Um, and that was a large part. That was what I called the panel, you and I and the other guys did. I gave it the overall title, Murder Most Foul. And then I think all of us, it's kind of talk about the 800-pound elephant in the room. How do you, yeah, that's, yeah, 17 minutes of, and then, so, and then, I mean, thank you for the material, Bob, but of course, when you, right, here's, Dylan's promotion, the only interview Dylan gave relating to that song, and I think maybe to the whole album, was to Douglas Brinkley, who's a
Mhm.
presidential historian, and they hardly talk about the song. And they said, I mean, the song is full of all sorts of allusions and about how there must have been a conspiracy, the greatest magic trick ever under the sun. Ask Ruby and Oswald, they ought to know. Just filled with stuff that's great fodder for a writer of books or a critic of Dylan. And but certainly with Bob Dylan, does not, unlike Rob Reiner, who has got this podcast going on now in which he meticulously is going through evidence for a particular theory week by week, Bob Dylan does not state who he thinks actually killed Kennedy, just that the official story is not the story. Oh, and by the way, the age of the Antichrist has just begun. That just thought I'd mention it.
Yeah. And also, that reminds me too. Like the reason Al Cooper, after the first few gigs he played,
Right.
he bailed because he said, "We're playing Dallas," and he didn't want to go on tour. They figured if they did that to Kennedy, what are they going to do to Dylan? So,
Well, I mean, it's funny. I just, like I said, I was giving this talk in Dallas, and I realized, oh, I mean, obviously, I knew that talking in Dallas would have this resonance, but I hadn't really thought about who the audience would be, especially at the Dallas Jewish Historical Society. It was like, it was a lot of old Jews like me, but these people, whereas I had been on, East 86th Street in New York, these people were, 5 and 10 and 15 years old in
in
Dallas,
Dallas.
being Jewish when this Jewish guy killed Oswald. So I mean, you know, I mean, I did a lot of research. I had a lot of good stories and anecdotes, but certainly, if there's ever a volume 2 or a revised edition, I'd heard a lot of firsthand stories just from people, it literally happened, in their town, and it was not abstract and it was not a news item and it was not theoretical. It was like right there, both those killings.
So the fact that he was Jewish, was that like broadcast in neon letters kind of thing, or is it just an unspoken kind of thing?
You know, he said it was, I certainly don't think I knew it at the time. I don't remember my family mentioning it either way, but I think again, if I'd been an adult, I think once the word came out about him, I think that's part of why his rabbi got involved. I think he was almost doing damage control. I think he generally cared about Ruby. I haven't been able to find out if he was an opponent of the death penalty or if that was part of the reason. But when Ruby was indicted, the indictment was the people of the state of Texas versus Jacob Rubenstein, which which is his real name.
Yeah.
And then actually, in the rabbi's notes, he mentions that the DA, who was Henry Wade, who you may know better from Roe v. Wade, that
Ooh.
that Henry Wade,
Hmm.
Henry Wade made a point of saying to the rabbi, "I did not intend to be anti-Semitic when I referred to him as Jacob Rubenstein in the indictment." So even Wade was, somehow realized maybe. I mean, the only thing I'll say is Ruby, not the only thing, because I'm going to just keep talking, but one thing I'll say is that's one of those expressions. The only thing I'll say, well, but you can't say anything beyond. Ruby, um, Ruby was terrible with paperwork. One of the reasons, that there's a theory that maybe he intended suicide by cop was because his life, including his finances, were in a shambles. He owed $40,000 in 1963 money to the IRS. He owed money to his family. He owed, and um, so wait, I was definitely making a point. Um, One thing I'll say,
About being Jewish or being.
yeah. So Ruby's brother, his sister, he was one of 8 siblings, and his sisters were married, so they had different last names. But at one point, all he and his brothers decided they would all, except for one of them who didn't want to, change their name to Ruby. But it's highly likely that Jack never really did the paperwork to legally change his name, that he just called himself Ruby, but never, whereas his brothers actually went to court and got the the documentation you need. So maybe that was legally his name. So, um, you know, I think probably the Jews in the audience learning about him and the anti-Semites in the audience, I think those are the two audiences that cared that he was Jewish.
Wow.
I think for most people it didn't make a difference. And I don't remember my family ever talk. You know, you're in the same ballpark age.
Mhm.
Just somehow it was like the Kennedy assassination. Oh, and then the Beatles. I mean, as Dylan says in the
Exactly.
Beatles are coming, the Beatles are coming. They're going to hold your hand. Somehow life went on. I mean, sort of from my own particular obsessions, interests, and career. When I was researching the Stan Lee biography, I went, let me see how Marvel dealt with it, how they dealt with the Kennedy assassination in the comic books and the letters pages, and you know, they didn't deal with it. There was just, when they needed a president in a story, they had Kennedy. Next time they needed a president, they had Johnson. There was no address. I don't know what DC did. I don't think they did much of anything more. 10 years later, when Stanley was more of a celebrity and when people started caring what Stan and Marvel thought about the events of the day, then he did weigh in, even not necessarily taking a dramatic stand, but at least addressing that Vietnam existed, that civil rights issues existed. There was no dealing at all in Marvel Comics. The one story Stan Lee has is that he used to put out. Marvel was part of a bigger publishing company, and Stan would sometimes do photo funny books. He would take like movie stills or news stills from the news and put funny captions and word balloons in famous people's mouths. And there was one that had, and because it was Camelot, so a couple of issues had Kennedy on the cover, including one that Stan's story was always, it went out, this issue with Kennedy on the cover saying something funny went out to the printer, and we had to call it back because it would have been too painful. I don't think that's true. I think maybe it's partly true. Maybe they called it back, but a bunch still went out because the way magazine distribution worked in those days, it took 2 weeks really between uh, a periodical leaving the printers and getting to a newsstand where, in the Midwest or something. So maybe they called some of them back, but there's plenty of copies of that issue on eBay that you could buy. It's got Kennedy, who's the most recognizable person in the world, and he's got the presidential seal behind him, and on the podium is the presidential seal, and the line Stan gave him is, "Allow me to introduce myself." This is before Beggar's Banquet, so it was not a Mick Jagger reference.
And is that a reference to Altamont, which Bob Dylan wrote about and sang about in Murder Most Foul? It's
right.
all connected.
It's all connected. So that I don't know, whatever the hell question I was answering. That's the
end. So just a couple more things. Murder Most Foul, it was a recent Dylan thing. In Philosophy of Modern Song, he kind of goes off bizarrely on Jack Ruby a little bit. There's one of those weird magazine things that he does.
Magazine. And there's the picture of Ruby killing Oswald.
Yeah.
I'm sorry, Ruby killing Oswald, and then with a song called "Ruby, Are You Mad," which is not, but he does talk a little bit about Ruby, and even talks about Stan Lee in another sense in the article about CIA Man. He mentions Stan Lee, which is odd, but yeah, he's clearly very. Again, I don't want to speak for Bob Dylan. I don't know if obsessed is the word, but he did write a.
He's affected by it, like we all were. Yeah.
Yeah, and then my talk, which was part of our panel. I sort of try to compare that to what the other Greenwich Village folk singers in 1963, were saying and singing about. I think the most famous, and oddly enough, this of course ties back into Dylan's, Christianity, right? Phil Oakes writes a song called "The Crucifixion" about Kennedy, which maybe, I don't know if it's Phil Oakes' most famous song, but it's one of his most famous songs, and certainly maybe the one where he tried. It was maybe his most philosophical. It's very, the song, the word, the name Kennedy is Kennedy and Dallas and Ruby and Oswald are never mentioned in that song. It's all done by metaphor, but the metaphor was clear enough that when he played it for Bobby Kennedy started crying. So but yeah, so that Dylan had this response to it that took so many years, and that he'd allude to it. Look, it's got to be very Dylan, as your listeners don't need to be told, but I'll tell them anyway because I'm here. Had a kind of celebrity that was unique. Maybe the Beatles had that kind of. Dylan wasn't just a sex symbol and a singer, and somehow people came to think that Bob Dylan knew the answer to everything and could solve their problems, and had some higher knowledge than normal humans do, and hence he had and has this rabid fan base that's above, and not maybe in numbers, although certainly at one point he was the biggest pop star in the world, but in what people expect of him and want from him, and think he can provide. And I think that is the closest maybe that a pop star could get to what Kennedy was, and the way people felt about him and the whole Kennedy family. So I think Dylan, I mean, look, and obviously John Lennon had that kind of effect on people too. And, he didn't have Dylan there to protect him. He,
Too soon.
Yeah.
And then
that was clearly, that was the worst case scenario. And look, I would have to think that, probably somebody as star of Dylan's stature and longevity he and his people must get threats like that all the time. We just don't hear about it. That must be, but so yeah, I would think Dylan can relate to that in a way that almost no one else on earth can.
And of course, I mean, this is stuff everyone would know, but right after that, Dylan left politics pretty quickly. I mean, to
He
overt
did.
political stuff, and then but he still, like he mentioned, where many in East Texas, where many a martyr fell,
Right.
20 years later. So and he wrote about Kennedy and I Shall Be Free. So it's like he's been in and out throughout.
Yeah. And that thing about somebody, threatening to shoot him on stage was, several years later, where, and then of course, and I guess the other famous thing is that this happened only like a month or less after the assassination, when he was getting that award from the American Civil Liberties Union. That was
Right.
what was basically a fundraiser for them. And he had been, the story goes, he was like schmoozing with James Baldwin and other people, but they were waiting. I guess he was probably the highlight of the evening, and they made him wait till last to get his award. And so he was drinking, and he gets up and he basically talks about how, that he could relate to Oswald, and he didn't say Oswald by name, but the guy who shot Kennedy, the guy who shot the president. I can relate to him, and I understand him. And that didn't go over well, And then that was after he'd like insulted everybody there and told them they were like old and out of touch. And then, and then a couple of days later, I think the people who had sponsored it like insisted that he apologize. And so he puts out this kind of, prose poem that's not only not an apology, he like doubles down on relating to Oswald and how out of touch they, but so, at least that makes more sense, that like, 3 weeks after the assassination, it'll be on his mind.
Right.
But 60 years later, and of course the whole context, it coming out in the middle, in the earliest days of COVID, when everybody was freaking out, and the neighborhood, I live near a hospital in Manhattan, so there were just endless sirens. I mean, it was just living in this crazy, amped up alternate universe, and suddenly Dylan drops, not just a song, but a 17-minute song about the Kennedy assassination. Yeah, that was kind of intense.
So, and then closing a couple things, you told the story about a certain 70s TV star who you want to tell that story?
Yeah, well, it's very, I had this speaking interviewing. It was an interview, it was an interview. I was interviewed by Stephen Fagan, the curator of the Sixth Floor Museum, but I also had this PowerPoint presentation, and it's just one of the story where I'm going to telegraph the ending. But Gabe Kaplan, you may recall, is the star of Welcome Back, Kotter, in the '70s, and I guess the Dylan connection there is John Sebastian doing the theme song, Welcome Back, and Sebastian being, of course, part of the whole Greenwich Village
Yeah.
music scene.
Mhm.
Um,
And he played on Dylan's record.
right, right, he did. So there's a logical connection that anybody could see. So
see, it's
so
all a
Gabe,
game, all this stuff. It's like, just trying to put it all together. It's fun.
it's all a performance, as what Mick Jagger or James Fox said in Performance.
Yeah.
So Gabe Kaplan has this story about how at the very beginning of his career, he was 19, and he was starting out as a comedian, mostly in strip clubs. And somebody told him, there's a lot of work in Dallas, and so he takes this crazy, nonstop 2-day drive to Dallas, where somebody hooks him up and introduces him to Jack Ruby. And anyway, so he did this audition for Ruby. Ruby hits the ceiling when Kaplan uses a mild obscenity, because in Dallas, turned out that laws were very strict. Ruby hits the ceiling. What do you think? I run a toilet here, and but then he calms down. A day or two later, he and Ruby are at a party or a card game together, and Ruby like brings him a Dracula mask as like a peace offering. Here, use. Oh, the joke was about Dracula. How Dracula would be more interested in a woman's neck than in her tits, is the horrible obscenity that Ruby hit the ceiling for. So
Mhm.
here, take this Dracula mask, and next time you do it, it'll be really even funnier. And I'll call you in a couple of months, and I'll call you soon, and we'll have you come back here for a real a real engagement, performing at the club, and he never called him. And then, of course, 2 or 3 months later, Ruby killed Oswald. So I, giving proper credit, luckily, that I heard this told by Gabe Kaplan on Gilbert Gottfried's podcast. I summarized that story in the book, and I also used it in my slideshow. And I have a picture of Gabe Kaplan from the Welcome Back Kotter days. And then, Kaplan had been, he kind of left that aspect of show business and became like a professional poker player, including like hosting Poker with the Stars. But he looks nothing now like he did then. I'm looking in the audience, and this guy looks familiar, but everybody looks familiar. It's a bunch of, old Jews in the audience, like myself. So then I'm signing books afterwards. Guy comes up. Who should I make it out to? I'll just make it out to Gabe. And I look at him and I go, oh, you're Gabe Kaplan, aren't you? Turns out he was still obviously interested in Ruby. I think he splits his time between Dallas and LA. And a friend of his told him this was happening. And so he and I, we went out to dinner. It was very surreal. But yeah, so Gabe, of all the things, I did not think that Mr. Kotter would show up. It was and is a surreal thing. He gave me a very nice blurb for the book. He liked the book. So that, that was, of all the celebrities I might meet, say involved with this, that was, I'm just really glad that I, both in the book and in the presentation, credited him and Gilbert for the for the source of that story.
All right, so everyone buy the book. What are you up to next? Can you share anything about your future?
I have a few projects that I'm trying to develop. Right now, really, I'm in heavy duty promotion mode for the book. I'm considering this the year of the 60th anniversary year of the assassination. So if anybody, and I've also did my own audio book for all my books. So if you
really cool.
If you enjoyed this past hour and a half, imagine 14 hours of this coming piped into your headphones.
It's not as long as Barbra Streisand's.
I know. Well, that's a new record. Oh my God! In every sense of the word. Holy cow! Yeah. So I'm available and eager, to do appearances, podcasts. If you yourself, if anybody out there was the actual assassin, if you're the source of the conspiracy, I'll come be on your podcast. Just please let me leave in one piece. That's all I.
So what did you think? I don't even know if. But what about the JFK movie? What did you think of that?
It's so long ago.
And I only saw it once in the theater.
It's a nice fantasy. So is the movie Ruby. So is the Umbrella Academy that stars Ruby. So is the movie. So is the movie made by Stan Lee's cousin called Ruby and Oswald.
It's all connected.
Starred. I mean, I don't like it when somebody sort of takes off in fiction. Oliver Stone is such a great filmmaker that anything he puts on the screen, unfortunately, people are going to think is the official story and the real story. I find that unfortunate, especially because that Jim Garrison theory has been so discredited. There's a podcast by Andrei Codrescu, who some of you may know is the longtime NPR commentator and poet. Andrei, I'm sorry I mispronounced your name, and he has done a thing that with an author whose name I'm blanking on, that riffs on a very interesting guy named Kerry Thornley, who served in the Marines with Oswald, who has a very interesting story as a counterculture figure. I just think the problem with the whole story, and especially with Ruby, is that there's so many different stories that can be told about them. They're great fodder for fiction, and I tried in my book. That's why I say, not as a joke, I don't solve the Kennedy assassination. I just try to present things, facts, and speculations about Ruby, but label them as such. And hopefully, I've written it in entertaining and engrossing enough manner So I mean, I like those as entertainment, but I wouldn't take JFK as pure history. Although, as we know, a lot of things we think we know, we just know from the movie versions.
Yeah. Um,
So
but you do solve who killed Oswald.
that, yes, I think I got that right.
All right. Well, this has been such a pleasure, Danny. I mean, it was great talking
Same
to you
here.
in Tulsa. I'm glad you asked me to be part of that panel.
Oh, I'm so glad you were
Um,
part of it.
and yeah, so there'll be a link for the book. I'm sure you can get it all the usual places like Amazon and your local bookstore and Barnes and
Oh,
Noble and all that sort of stuff. And
great.
Danny is available for talking, anywhere. I mean,
Yeah, and
and
I'll come MC your bar mitzvah if you want. If you want to have your bar mitzvah in the same place Bob Dylan had his, I would be glad to go to Hibbing and do that as well. So it all comes full circle. Thank you so much, Harold. This was great.
all right, thank you, and I will, as I said, there'll be in the blog that goes along with this. There'll be links to everything.
Sounds good. Thank you. Take care.
Okay, bye bye.
Bye bye.